This next video is about the very first question that we ask in a band meeting. How is it with your soul?
Yeah, this question, it's an old question. It's a spiritual formation question. And it's a question that we often don't ask one another, but we think is really important. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult to understand what a soul is, so we sort of want to talk about that for a second. Biblically speaking, in Genesis 2, verse 7, it says that God breathed into Adam, and he became a living soul. The Hebrew word there is nephesh. He became a living being. So God created Adam's frame first, his hips, lips, and fingertips, so to speak. And until he breathed the life breath of God into Adam, he wasn't a living being. But when he became a living being, he had this thing called a soul, or he was a soul. Later on in the Gospels, Jesus is speaking, and he says in Mark 8:36, "What does it profit a person to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul?" The interesting thing about that is, if you think about it, we live most of our lived experience, or at least our observation of other people, is really the outside. It's the outside of their experience, or the externals that we see of a person. But we really can't see where they live most of their lived experience, which is in their soul. Jesus here is saying, what would it profit a man or woman to have everything in the world externally, all the wealth and power and whatever you could accumulate, and yet forfeit or lose at the level of soul? So there is something about the interior of our lives that really is more essential and more important than any of the externals. And so your soul essentially is, I like to say, your inner being. And particularly what we're aiming at with your inner being is how are you doing emotionally and how are you doing spiritually? So say more about that, Anna Grace.
Yeah, I think another way to ask this question would be just what Mark said. How am I doing emotionally? How am I doing spiritually? If I were to articulate what is inside of me, what would I say? And this is not just a warm-up question. We ask this question first because it's really a locating question. In some ways, it almost provides a little preview for how you're going to answer the next four. And I've even found, just in my own practice of banding, that sometimes this question can be the most difficult one for me to answer. Very rarely do I pause and say, how is it with my soul? Mark said that's not a question we often ask each other, but it's also not a question that we often ask ourselves.
Yeah, so sometimes I like to think about this first question as a locating question. You'll remember maybe that in Genesis 3, chapter 8, when God came looking for Adam after Adam and Eve had eaten of the fruit and sinned, Adam had hid himself with fig leaves, and he hid among the trees, and God came for him, and he said, "Where are you?" And Adam said, "Well, I was naked, so I hid." God said, "Who told you you were naked?" And, the sort of story unfolds from there. But a lot of times when we read that passage, "Where are you?" we sort of think like, here comes this God, this sort of, God that's come to punish. But I actually think, I remember reading that text several years ago, and I felt the kindness of God in it. This sense that God always wants to know where his kids are. He cares about our hearts. He cares about our souls and where we are. And he's always asking, where are you, Anna Grace? Where are you, Mark? And so that's sort of become this sort of posture in me of it's deeply spiritual to ask someone, where are you? And that's what how is it with your soul is. How are you doing on the inside? How is your heart? Where are you? And so when I attempt to answer this question, oftentimes I actually just take a moment and I just sort of scan a bit, like, okay, where are you at? How are you doing? And again, what I do is I sort of take my spiritual temperature. How connected do I feel in this given moment or week to God? And I also check in with myself emotionally. I'm like, what are you feeling? Are you feeling calm and relaxed and peaceful? Are you feeling anxious and worked up? Our spectrum of emotions could be any number of 300, words we would use to describe it. And simply speaking, when we answer how our soul is, we're just sort of saying, okay, I'm going to take an internal scan. I'm going to say how I'm doing in my life with God. I'm going to say, generally speaking, where I'm at emotionally. It could take about 60 seconds to answer, and that's it. It's just sort of how you kick off your time.
Yeah, there have been many times where I have gone to answer this question and my answer has surprised me. And I even think of the psalmist who says, why are you downcast, my soul? Where on paper, if you were to look at my week, or if someone were even to just ask me, how has your week been? It would be great. It's been an awesome week. But internally, when I look at how is my life with God? How is my emotional well-being? It doesn't always line up with what you see on the outside.
Yeah, so same thing as Anna Grace said. For me, oftentimes you can be going along in your week, and you'll realize in that moment that you ask how your soul is doing, that it might be the first moment all week that you've stopped to pause and to self-reflect and to answer that question, how am I doing really? We believe this is a vital practice. Sometimes you'll answer similarly. My soul is fair today. I feel pretty connected to God. I'm pretty peaceful. And sometimes your soul will feel like a storm is raging on the inside. But all we're trying to do as we kick into answering these questions is to be honest. How are you doing really? That's another way that you could frame this question. We hope this is helpful for you.